Okay, we have a subscriber that asked a question that we want to answer in this video, and it was in response to the AMD Threadripper PRO WRX80 workstation build, kind of generic about what was available. And the question he asked from Joey Barron: can you explain the difference between M.2 and U.2 drives? Also, does the ASUS motherboard support M.2 RAID 0? Joey, first of all, the second part, RAID 0, absolutely. All the systems we've been looking at that are being built right now for the last 3 years, to the best of my recollection, all will support RAID 0. And will this support RAID 0? Absolutely. And as you well know, that motherboard includes a quad card, which is a big deal. Now for the question about what's the difference in M.2 versus U.2. That's kind of as broad as it is long. It's let's look at the similarities and the differences. This is probably the best image we have, which I pulled from ASUS website of one of the images that shows the connectors. And what I want to demonstrate here, we have 2, 4, 6, 8 SATA ports, and what we have here are a couple of connectors for U.2. And the point I want to demonstrate, there's 2 U.2 connectors on that motherboard. Okay, U.2 connectors are a little bit different depending on the part number they use, and if we compared this to the Gigabyte part, it's completely different. You won't find, even though they're U.2 connectors on the Gigabyte motherboard, they don't call them U.2. They call them by a different name. You start getting into things like slim SACE and mini SACE. And I'll just say that as far as I know, the motherboard does not include the cables, but the point I want to make, M.2 and U.2, the commonalities. First of all, each one of them requires 4 PCI Express lanes. And I'm not talking about the Intel 750 that's been discontinued that used 8 lanes. We're talking about just the difference in the drives. Now, an M.2, about the size of a stick of chewing gum. Some people don't like that reference, but I think it's a good one. Because of the size of the package, it makes it easy to install. Now, one of the differences you'll read about with M.2 versus U.2, M.2 has to be installed on something. So they can be installed on a motherboard, they can be installed on a card, but they cannot just sit by themselves. And whereas the U.2 can be, and the U.2 is in the 2.5-inch form factor. Because it's the 2.5-inch form factor, it's real easy to take something like a 2.5-inch drive, and then I put it in something like a removable rack like this, which turns it into a 3.5-inch device that I can plug in, but this is for SATA. Now, when we talk about M.2, there's 2 types of M.2. There's M.2 SATA, and that requires 1 PCI Express lane. So every time you see a SATA port, that's 1 lane. So if we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, that's 8 lanes. Okay, so you've got an M.2 SSD, but did you have an M.2 NVMe? Everything we talk about is M.2 NVMe PCI Express, whether it's version 3 or version 4. It's all about the speed. And historically, supposedly, because of the form factor, the size of the 2.5-inch, you could go to a higher capacity. Well, remember at one time, U.2 was on all the motherboards, and it was quite a while before we finally got access to a U.2 drive. And when they finally came out, they weren't performing like they were supposed to. And yes, now they do, but I think what we need to look at is not just the interface, but we need to look at the price per megabyte. That's really where this is all about, because that's the way we've always judged any drive we've ever used, whether it's a spinning drive, whether it's an M.2 drive, an SSD, whatever. What is the cost per megabyte? So if we take that into consideration, historically, a U.2, because of the form factor, could be a higher capacity. Let's take a look at a couple of drives. I'll show you one I can only find on Newegg that's easy if somebody wanted to buy one. But I got to tell you, if you want to buy that drive, I really think you're better off stepping back and saying, for that kind of money, where's the best value bang for the buck? Because with everything we do with rendering, with content creation, editing is easy, but when you start rendering, that's a different animal. And it's not about the drive, it's about the processing power, which is either the CPU or the GPU. So for the money of the drive I'm going to show you, I think you're better off putting that into a GPU, but that's just my opinion. Let's take a look. We'll go to Newegg. Let's take a look over here on the left at the form factor. For a 2.5-inch U.2, there are 40 listed. For an M.2 2280, there's a lot more. So let's go to the 2.5-inch U.2 and let's see what we find. And let's see what kind of capacity we've got. There's one that goes to 4 terabytes. So let's try the 4 terabyte, see what we're looking at. It says there's 8. And we find 1. So this is an Intel 4 terabyte TLC. It's PCI Express 3.1 by 4, and it is 4 terabytes. Let's go back, and this time we'll remove that. Instead of looking at 4 terabytes, Let's look at something a little faster under PCI Express 4.0. Okay, here's one, Intel Optane. Intel Optane U.2 PCI Express 4.0x4, so it uses 4 lanes. And if you notice the configuration of the drive, it's the 2.5-inch form factor, but it also has a heatsink built around it, built into it. The point being, it's a drive that you can handle. It's not as susceptible to ESD as an M.2 drive is. Now, and to give you some historical perspective on M.2, U.2, and going back, and this kind of gets involved in RAID, so I want to keep it short, keep it brief, and some of the stuff that might be a deep dive we'll do in a separate video. But remember, RAID started with SCSI. Once we had SCSI, then RAID migrated over to parallel ATA. Okay, once we had RAID on parallel ATA, then we went and a new technology came out called SATA. We had SATA 1, 2, 3. Once we had SATA, then a new feature came along, and that was AHCI. So without getting into the definition of the terminology, which is more confusing, it's just, let's say AHCI means hot swap, hot plug, which I'm a big fan of. But because of AHCI was separated, you didn't have to have RAID to have AHCI, and that's a function of RAID 5. And by the way, the motherboard we're talking about, by definition, it supports 4 levels, RAID 1, RAID 0, RAID 1.0, and I believe with the latest firmware updates, it now supports 5 being the hot swap, hot plug drive. So you can keep the system alive. And remember, this is all an enterprise technology. So when we're looking at an M.2, one of the things about an M.2 that you will read about that says you cannot hot swap an M.2 drive. Well, on the surface, that's true, but it is possible and it's doable and the technology exists. What we were waiting for was someone to come out, and ICDoc has done that, and the drive I just showed you that we use for moving our SSD from the SSD recorder. This is a hot swap device. I take a 2.5-inch drive, put it in this rack, then I take this rack and put it in a hot swap so that I have access to what I record off that SSD. That's the only reason now we use SSDs. We go from spinning drives to M.2 drives. Don't use U.2 drives. I think they're too pricey for a price per megabyte. But my point being, this is something I can transport easily, whereas an M.2 is more susceptible to ESD. Okay, ICDoc has come out with a device that will let you install in a rack, which is another reason to have removable racks, removable M.2 drives. And I believe they've got one that will fit 4 drives, 4 M.2 drives in one 5.25-inch drive bay, and they can be hot swapped. My concern is though that they don't have any design on them right now for a heatsink, so air blows up through the bottom. Let's take a look at one. I really should do this in a separate video, and I'll have a link up to this, but ICDoc makes a product called Tough Armor, full metal cages for hot swap. And this is a fairly new product they've come out with. It works with M.2, and they've also got one for a U.2. But again, 4 drives. But the problem you get into with doing something like that, 4 things are required. 1, the drive, 2, the hot swap rack, 3, the cable, and 4, whatever it plugs into. Now, you've got the connector on the motherboard, which this has on the WRX80, both the ASUS and the Gigabyte. You just want to be sure you get the right cable. However, something like this typically would be used with something like a Broadcom MegaRAID card. That's a whole nother animal, but if you want to get into hot swap with M.2 drives or hot swap with U.2 drives, that would be the way to do it. But that's kind of on a side note. But to talk about the differences and the similarities, to reiterate, an M.2 is something very small, about the size of a stick of chewing gum, and there's a difference in the M.2 SATA versus an M.2 NVMe PCI Express drive. The normal format is 2280, meaning 22 millimeters wide, 80 millimeters long. They come as long as 110 millimeters. They're shorter, and because of some of the questions we're getting asked, this Supermicro card is a good example because it'll take up to a 22-110. But if you notice where that plastic fitting is at that holds the drive in, that position can be changed and brought back down over here. So we could put a 22-110 on this card. Some of the cards only support up to a 2280. So as the question has been asked about how big of a media, when I say media, an M.2 NVMe PCI Express drive, a dual adapter will hold. We're looking more at that, and we will point those kind of things out. So to reiterate, if you want to use something like this, it's available, but 4 things are required: memory, drive, cable, and then of course the connector. If it's on the motherboard, great. If it's not on the motherboard, then you got to have a card for it, something like a Mega RAID. Now, because we have 2 ports on here, that's not a dedicated resource. Let's take a look. Now the fine print. The U.2_1 shares bandwidth with the M.2_2, and correspondingly the U.2_2 shares bandwidth with M.2_3, which means when both those number 2 and number 3 are populated, the corresponding U.2 will be disabled, which is a good thing because you're talking 4 lanes and 4 lanes, that's 8 lanes, and those 8 lanes, M.2 or U.2. So the package is different. And another thing that I kind of pointed out but didn't really detail is capacity. Supposedly because a 2.5-inch drive can be a higher capacity, when all this started, the U.2 was supposed to be able to have a greater capacity. Yeah, but at quite a price. Whereas right now, I think the largest we've got on the M.2 that I'm aware of is an 8 terabyte. So do the math, price per megabyte. The U.2 is an interesting technology, but it's kind of come and gone, and it's on the workstation. It was on regular desktop boards for a while. They took it off, and now it's more of an enterprise type solution, but it's an extremely expensive storage product. And if I'm going down the list of things I need to do with a workstation, number 1, I want to be able to put in decent video. Number 2, I want to be able to utilize that quad card that comes with it. And yes, I've got 7 16-lane slots, but I still got a shared resource, whether I use the M.2s on the motherboard or whether I use the U.2. And based on the price per megabyte, I would stick with the M.2. So I hope that kind of answers that question. I hope that helps put that in perspective. At least that's my perspective and my perception on the situation. And if I miss something, I'd appreciate if you guys point it out, because a lot of times we hit the high points, but the high points, when we do the deep dive, book and verse, we want to make sure we have the specifics correct. Details matter. Now here on Amazon is an example of a Western Digital 3.84 Gold Enterprise Class NVMe U.2 PCI Express. What I don't know, and I would imagine if you'll notice the price, this is probably PCI Express 3. Yeah, here we are. According to Newegg, that's PCI Express 3.1/4. So the details matter. It's good to know that. Based on the date when the drive became available of 2020, that should be PCI Express 4. However, it's PCI Express 3. So I just want to point that out. Another thing you'll notice on the cable, if you notice that cable on the bottom on the right, that is the connector that plugs into the U.2 on the motherboard. Whereas the other connector, and if you look out the back of that, I'll move that over a bit, that has data and power, so it splits it out. And if you're going to implement a U.2 on the Gigabyte board, it uses a different connector, and I wish they'd do it by the old part number instead of just by the name. It's a lot easier to find. But my point is, the cable you use on the ASUS board is more of a standard cable. The other standard that, and I won't get into the names, but the other part that Gigabyte uses looks like a elongated SATA connector. Let's just say that. Now, because there's 2 ports on the motherboard, this particular cable will supply that 2 ports, and it'll give you access to 2 drives. So you get an idea of the price. Having those numbers helps, because by 8 is specific. It's a 2-port U.2 to an NVMe cable. So you got, it's a D-linker, LSI. The names on so much of this have changed hands so many times. LSI, Adaptec, Broadcom. Broadcom has all that now. But this cable should work for that motherboard. We'll have a link up for those that are interested in implementing a U.2. But I wouldn't, because it's just not, on a price per megabyte, it just doesn't make sense. That's just my opinion. But if you want to, your results may vary. Keep us posted on your progress. Now, the other part of Joey's question about the M.2 supporting RAID 0, yes. And I want to get a little into that, but I don't want to get a lot into it, other than to say, yes, it supports RAID 0. And the question comes up about how many drives will RAID support. Okay. On Intel, With a VROC chip, the VROC chip will support 24 drives. However, because of the resources on the Intel platform, it's only realistic to expect 12 drives. On AMD, according to the documentation, I'll have a link up and I'll show you, it'll support 10 drives. And that brings up another issue because what we've seen, and I didn't realize, on the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire, we've had 6 drives on the board several times, but we never had 8 drives. So that would be 4 drives on the motherboard, 4 drives on the quad card. So we'd have 2 to the CPU, we'd have 2 to the chipset. So we never had all 8 drives that way because of an unequal performance. As we've tested, we know the 2 to the CPU are the fastest, the 2 to the chipset are the slowest, and the 2 on the slots are just a tad bit behind the ones, but pretty close, that are to the CPU. Okay, so that's 4, 5, 6 drives. What we didn't realize when we started messing with the dual adapter, we went from 6 drives, we went to 8 drives. The question is, and this is relevant, how many drives can you put on the motherboard before things go bonkers? Meaning, what I mean by bonkers. If you put 7 drives on the board, you've got to have 4G decoding enabled. Pretty wild, huh? So if you've got 4 drives and 2, that's 6, you won't have that issue. If you go to 8 drives, because you're over the limit at 7, you'll have that issue. So there's another reason to have above 4G decoding, but it has to be turned on beforehand. Otherwise, as you saw in the video that we did, we had to pull the cards out to figure out why all of a sudden out of PCI Express resources. We had to get above that 4G decoding to make that work. And there's other things that have to occur, like booting under unified EFI and all that kind of stuff. So that's why we go through all this stuff, because details matter. And I will show some more of that information and documentation in another video. Now this documentation, I know I just said 10 drives, and that's what the documentation used to say. The documentation with the AMD RAID Expert, and this is 2021, so it's current, it's new, says a total of 14 devices. I had read before that it was 10. So 14 devices, which is an interesting count. So that would be like if you had 4, 8, 12, which would be 3 quad cards and 2 on the motherboard. One way to get to that number. It's interesting how some of that all plays out. Now, as far as addressing the cards, if you've got one of the cards like the Gigabyte that has a copper heatsink, Gigabyte also has jumpers on the cards where you could put as many 4 cards as in a machine. And the jumpers are there so that you can adjust that jumper so that it can be recognized by the fan software to adjust that particular fan. Anyway, just throw that out there. So to reiterate, the numbers now say 14 drives, which is 2 more than what you theoretically could support on Intel. Now, remember, the VROC chip will support 24, but if you count the resources, the way I did my math, yours may be different. You may get different results. I counted out 12. So we'll go through that again in another video about RAID, but those are just some numbers I'll throw out there to food for thought. And I'll have a link up to this AMD RAID Expert user guide. You can also pull this down when you pull down the chipset information. All that stuff is up there, but I'll have a link to it. And for those wondering about the chipset, when you download that AMD chipset driver, it's got a full list from the WRX80, TRX40, X570 on down the chain down to the AMD A320. So all those chipsets will support RAID 0, whatever this documentation has. Now, for those more interested in RAID, before we get to a video about types of RAID and levels of RAID, types being a hardware RAID versus a hybrid BIOS RAID, which is what we're talking about here. A hybrid BIOS RAID is a bootable RAID. An operating system RAID is a RAID drive you can use, but you can't boot it. A hardware RAID is something I would get into if I were looking at putting in an extra card like a Mega RAID. That's a hardware RAID card. But when you're using quad cards or using dual M.2 NVMe adapters, like we've still got a list, we're going to swing back around and get through that. I feel like we've gone down another rabbit hole, but an important one. Anyway, to reiterate, when you get into those kind of cards, those are not hardware RAID cards. It's kind of what I call a poor man's RAID. If you want real RAID, you got a card, it's got its own BIOS chip on board, it will append the motherboard BIOS, and you configure that RAID from that card BIOS. That's hardware RAID. That would be a place you can use M.2 or U.2 drives. It's an enterprise type RAID. But I wanted to put this up because it's relevant to content creation and stuff we do with video editing. If you're doing a lot of rendering, this article on B&H is really good about talking about the different levels of RAID. And again, to reiterate, we have RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 1.0, or as they call it, RAID 10, but it's actually 1 plus 0. And I believe they've implemented RAID 5. I've seen some of the documentation that has it. And I believe if you look in your BIOS with the latest BIOS updates, it's there. And that enables the hot swap, hot plug. That's the failover drive. In other words, if you're in RAID, you don't have to power down to pull a drive. With that kind of a setup, whether it's an M.2 with the IC dock or a U.2, but even a U.2 to do hot swap, you still got to have a rack. So, but with RAID 5, that allows you to hot swap a drive without having to power down the machine. That's the point of it. And with Intel, you got to have a VROC. We're going to get more into that as we progress because we've still got a workstation motherboard I want to share with you guys that kind of blew my mind when I found out about it. I want to talk about what it does, what it doesn't do, and we'll get to it. Okay, here's the other documentation that AMD has out on the Threadripper and says the maximum number of devices is 10. So I will have a link to both of these pieces of information so you can take a look at. And this talks about the controllers, the AMD SP3 series. What got me curious about this, and I got to looking, because there's a lot of us out there that are storage junkies, show of hands, and it's always the question of how many drives can I put in a machine. Some of it is practical, some of it is theoretical, and some of it's just kind of like, okay, how far can we go with this? What can we do with it? And that's why we're all about the resources. So some of these things are, you know, we've got a complete machine here as we look at this. With the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire, I mean, we're the only thing we're really wasting is resources with Thunderbolt 3 because there's 4 PCI Express lanes there that we can't use and we can't do anything with. But to get Thunderbolt 3, that's the trade-off. So if we want to do more stuff, to do more of these kind of things we're talking about, to add all these drives that are possible, we've got to move to a workstation. We've got to have a WRX80, unless we take a look at this next one coming up, and that's going to be a Xeon, and you're going to be surprised at the motherboard. So I hope you'll stick around for that video. So my name's Gil Boyd. This is Builder Buy. I want to thank you guys for watching. We're on to the next video.